It's pretty wild to think that a single verse, written something like 2,700 years ago, could become the bedrock for one of the world's biggest religions. But to really get this prophecy, we have to go back, way back, to the moment it was first spoken. And here's the thing, it wasn't some abstract theological statement. It was a live, urgent message for a king who was staring down the brink of war. So what we're going to do is strip away all those centuries of interpretation and try to find out what it meant right then and there in that moment of crisis. Right, we're diving into the famous prophecy of the virgin birth from the book of Isaiah. I mean, for billions of people, it's a cornerstone of their faith. But its first job? It was an urgent political message for a totally terrified king. So what was this sign really about? What did the people who heard it for the first time, what did they think it meant? Let's treat this like a historical detective story. Okay, first things first. Our story doesn't begin in a library or a church. It begins with the threat of war. We're smack in the middle of a super high-stakes geopolitical crisis, the kind that threatens to literally wipe an entire kingdom right off the map. So, picture this. The year is 734 BC. Up north, two kingdoms, Syria and Ephraim, they've teamed up. And who are they gunning for? The southern kingdom of Judah. Now, Judah's king, this guy named Ahaz, is in a full-blown panic. I mean, completely freaking out. His first instinct is to pick up the phone, so to speak, and call on a superpower for help, the Assyrians. But before he can make that call, the prophet Isaiah is sent to cut him off. And get this, the meeting spot is incredibly specific. It's the conduit of the upper pool, basically a critical part of Jerusalem's water supply. It's right there that Isaiah confronts the king, and his message is crystal clear. Look, forget foreign armies, trust in God. He tells Ahaz, this alliance against you, it's going to crumble. And to prove it, he offers him a sign. Any sign he wants. But Ahaz, he refuses. He won't ask for one. Well, since Ahaz won't ask for a sign, Isaiah basically says, fine, God will give you one anyway. And this is it. This one verse is the absolute core of our whole investigation. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And that name, Emmanuel, literally means God with us. And this, of course, is where the real puzzle starts. I mean, think about it. For this sign to mean anything to King Ahaz, it had to be about his crisis, right? The one happening right now. But then, fast forward a few hundred years, and the Gospel of Matthew quotes this exact verse, applying it directly to the birth of Jesus. So, how do we square that circle? Was it about a baby born back then, or a baby born centuries in the future, or was it somehow both? Okay, so our investigation's first clue, and maybe the most important one of all, comes down to a single, really heavily debated Hebrew word. If we can figure out what this one word really means, it might just unlock the whole prophecy. That word is Alma. Now, lots of Bibles translate it as virgin, but then you've got some modern scholars and even some translations like the RSV who go with young woman. And listen, this is not just splitting hairs. This one word completely changes what the sign is. So the big question is, what did Alma actually mean to Isaiah and the people listening to him back then? This brings us to a really key question. If Isaiah straight up meant virgin, why didn't he just use the more common Hebrew word for that, which is Bethula? Well, the answer is kind of subtle, but super interesting. Turns out Bethula could be a little ambiguous. It's even used in one place to describe a married widow. But Alma, the word Isaiah picked, seems to be more precise. It points to a young, unmarried woman who is old enough to get married, and in that culture, that status pretty much always implied she was a virgin. And we actually have a perfect case study for this, right in the book of Genesis. Let's look at the story of Rebekah. The text first calls her a Bethulah, or virgin, but then it immediately adds this little clarification, and no man had known her, almost like it's making extra sure you get the point. And then just a couple of verses later, she's also called an Alma. So boom, right there we have a crystal clear example from the text itself, where Alma is used for a woman who is definitely an unmarried virgin. But the plot thickens. A few centuries before Jesus was born, there's another huge development. Jewish scholars are translating the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. That translation is called the Septuagint. And when they get to Isaiah's prophecy, which word do they choose to translate Alma? They pick the Greek word Parthenos. And Parthenos unambiguously means virgin. This is the version that Matthew would have been reading, and it's the one he quotes, which really cemented that virgin interpretation deep into Christian tradition. But hold on, there's another major clue, and this one is hiding in plain sight. We just have to turn the page to the very next chapter of Isaiah. And what do we find? Another child, another prophecy, and another sign. Now, there's this really compelling theory that ancient prophets would often give prophecies in pairs. They'd give a short-term one that people could see happen pretty quickly, and then a long-term one. The idea was that when the short-term prophecy came true, it was like a down payment, a guarantee that you could trust the bigger, more distant one would also come true. And when you put the two prophetic kids from chapter 7 and 8 side by side, the differences are just, wow, they're striking. First, look at the names. You have Emmanuel, which means God with us, and then you have Mahar-shalal-Hashbaz, which means something like quick to the plunder, swift to the spoil. Totally different vibes. Then the mothers. In chapter 7, it's the Alma, but in chapter 8, it's the prophetess, which is Isaiah's own wife. And the timelines are crucial. The Emmanuel sign plays out over a few years, but the sign with Isaiah's son, it's super short, before the kid can even say Dada. All the evidence really points to two different children with two different mothers for two very different prophetic jobs.
So it looks like the birth of Isaiah's own son, Mahar-shalal-Hashbaz, was that short-term, verifiable sign. And sure enough, within just a couple of years, just like Isaiah said, the kingdoms of Syria and Ephraim were totally crushed by Assyria. When that happened, it gave everyone listening a real, tangible reason to believe that the much bigger, much more profound long-term prophecy about Emmanuel would also come true.
So what about King Ahaz? After all this, did he trust the sign? Well, his decision and what happened because of it echoes down through time with this just stunning, almost poetic irony a generation later. In short, Ahaz completely ignored Isaiah. He refused to put his trust in God's deliverance. Instead, he went ahead and made the exact political alliance he'd been warned not to make. He went and hired the Assyrian Empire to come save him from his neighbors. And Isaiah uses these amazing metaphors to describe the choice Ahaz made. Trusting God, that was like the gently flowing waters of Shiloah, a source of life for Jerusalem. But Ahaz, he chose the mighty floodwaters of the river, the Assyrian Empire. And Isaiah warns him, hey, that hired razor you're paying to shave your enemies, it's going to turn around and shave you too. And this is where the story comes full circle. Remember that very specific location where Isaiah first met Ahaz and gave him this warning? At the end of the conduit of the upper pool? That little detail, which seemed so random, is about to become incredibly important. Because here is the incredible payoff. A generation goes by, Ahaz is dead, his son Hezekiah is now the king, and that Assyrian army, the hired razor, has turned on Judah. They are laying siege to Jerusalem, and where does the Assyrian commander stand to shout his threats? The text tells us, he's at the conduit of the upper pool. The consequence of Ahaz's choice literally plays out on the exact same spot where he made it. The Assyrian floodwaters did exactly what Isaiah predicted. They swept into Judah, reaching, as the text says, up to the neck. But they didn't completely drown the kingdom. They didn't destroy it. Why not? Well, Isaiah gives us the answer. He says the invasion might cover the land, but it won't win. Because in the end, the land doesn't belong to Ahaz or his enemies. It is and always was the land of Emmanuel. So when you see this prophecy in its original context, with a terrified king, a massive war looming, and this intense choice between faith and fear, it doesn't take anything away from its later significance. If anything, I think it makes it even more powerful. It shows us that this incredible promise of God with us wasn't just born in a theological vacuum. It was forged in a moment of real, intense human crisis. And it's a great reminder that sometimes, to unlock the true power of these ancient texts, we have to start by understanding the very human stories they were written for in the first place.